but it is still not as revolutionary, I would say, if you proceed with the time speed of that reform, rather than when you see the executive part of it. But the result of that reform, as much as I see it now, is already showing itself very strongly, because what we see in this process of power transition, we see a judiciary which clearly shows to the new government in Georgia that they are independent. They will not allow that independence to be curtailed. And if they see that executive government is somewhat trying to attack them, name some of the judges by names when they don't like their decisions, like we've had when the Minister of Justice named 3 judges by first name, last name, saying that they are in opposition to the people of Georgia, to the government of Georgia. They fight back with the decisions in such a way that they show that it's the substantiation of the case that is the determining factor, what is the decision basically, and then how basically parties split in a competitive process rather than anything else, and they don't show that they have a fear factor of an executive. And especially, and it's really rewarding to see that, because it means that all the reforms that have been happening in the judiciary, changes of the legislative framework for judiciary, infrastructural developments, new judges that came into the system, educational process with them. It's the moment we are now in this very complex process of power transition. It pays off with them being strong enough of showing that that's how they see their role in the separation of the power in the country, that they are leading judiciary, they are the ones who decide independently on the cases, and they don't show any weakness of caving in basically to whatever the government would want from them to do. And that process was a good preparation for that in many sense. So I guess in that sense it was a successful process in many ways.
So when these police reforms took place, you were Deputy Justice Minister at the time?
I went at the time already. I'm not very initial stage of the reform, but then I've been Deputy Minister of Interior as well for more than a year. So I've been part of the development of the criminal police, and then the police academy, and then actually all the training opportunities for the patrol police as well. I've interviewed, I don't know, maybe 700 of them in many ways.
Wow.
We've been getting the new ones.
So, and let's make this personal. So you were very young at the time, and you're a woman in a society that still is a very macho society at times. Did you have to fight to be taken seriously?
I guess that not substantially, because that part comes, I might get too personal in a sense, but I guess that comes with the family relations in many ways. I have one brother who is younger than me, and for my father we always have been, and it's not that uncommon in Georgia. So when you're raised in the way where you have full opportunities and trust that your parents are giving to you, irrespective of the fact you're a girl or a boy, that's already in the background with which you never see yourself as being different in some sense. I don't even like, in some sense, special protective measures that the women are having in different political systems, because it takes it as if you are not competitive enough for that. So, but then in practicalities, you have to establish yourself with the ones who've never seen a woman maybe in that positions, because the biggest shock at that time was not even police, but then the Ministry of Justice, because at that time, part of the work that I've been doing there was initial steps that we took, very difficult ones, for the reform of penitentiary. And we've had a system at the time which was completely, it was a sham. I mean, the whole conditions of the prisons were already inhumane and degrading treatment, not speaking anything else. We've had organized crime controlling the prisons, rather than prison administration has having its own connections with organized crime. There were real challenges for the escapes and the protests that the prisoners with which they manipulated the process. So it was the third day of my job, I remember, when my head of one of the department of the penitentiary came in, and they said that we have a protest, and then it's a hunger strike now in the prison. So I had to go to the prison and speak with the people right away. So, and nobody expected at the time, a young woman coming in the prison in a very good condition and speaking with the inmates directly. And my decision was that I had to do it myself, so that they would see that it got to me, and then I'm really curious to hear what they had to say, what they have been on the hunger strike, and then to see that we meant to deliver changes to them as well. And for those who had been bad guys, for them to see that I won't be afraid of them being bad guys, basically, in the prisons. So it was unusual for them to see that, but then I would go frequently myself to the prisons and then speak with the inmates, but then had some tough conversations with not that much of the good guys as well in the prison system. And that already, I guess, was a reputation that I already had when I went to the Ministry of Interior. parliamentarian, so everybody knew who I was. So they already took me right away. Now that's a salty one.
Right, good. So, because you brought that up, let me jump ahead. I promised to get to Russia invasion, but the Saakashvili government, the national movement, lost the recent election. And one of the reasons, among many, were the videos that came out about the prisons just ahead of the election itself, where they abuse of prisoners and degrading treatment and poor conditions. How could that be in 2012, after the experience you had, that must have been 2004, 2005? 8 years later, 7 years later, it's still that way?
Well, what the videos and the way they came, and I don't really comment because we still haven't seen any evidence when it comes to systemic nature of that. But irrespective of that, even if it was not that systemic, it was already shocking what we have seen. We really had to come, many of us, back to our senses in terms of comprehending how that could have been possible to happen. Right. Because the beginning of the system of penitentiary reform was so comprehensive, really. It was new prison buildings that we have built to make sure that we had humane and good and modern standards for the living conditions for them to have, working potential for them to have in the prisons. We completely eliminated organized crime connectivity, groups connectivity with the prison system, so that because the organized crime groups were not controlling only crime activities outside of the prisons, but then they've been extorting substantial amount of the money, and they were using inmates as well. So they were managed to the inmates as well to a larger degree, because it was only a small clan who had that position in the prisons, and then the rest were sort of victims of that system, and that had been completely eliminated as well. And then this whole process was leading to the level where our goal was that it would never be pleasant to be in the prison for anybody because your freedom is restricted, but that it would have been not a punishment in itself to be in a prison, but then a possibility of some change the person could endure. Now that I look back, why it could have happened in the way it could happen, and one element that I think of is that whenever you restrict transparency in some sense, that's already a worrying factor where things could go in the wrong direction, because the system could be boiling in itself somehow, and you don't have that openness that is a guarantee, if not a guarantee, then assurance of some time that things like that would happen. And we've had a major riot, if I don't want to be mistaken in terms of the year, but it was, I guess, in 2007 when it happened, when it was a huge fight back by the organized crime at the time in one of the worst prisons that we've had, which is not in existence anymore. And I guess that was the moment when, at that time, the administration of the penitentiary, then Ministry of Penitentiary, when they fought against that, and they sort of successfully crushed the riot in the prison. It was the moment when they could have got afraid of what happened, why it happened, why still the organized crime could have done that. So I guess it became too strict then in the way how the prisons started to be administered for that, with that fear in mind. And some of the public monitoring elements that we've had, because at the time that I've been there, I remember we've had a big commission of public figures having working groups of public monitoring, and they had unlimited access to the prisons. That's what we did legislatively, so then by law. So they could go to the prisons and monitor whenever they wanted, and nobody would restrict them. That's what we did at the time. So, and there was an assurance that there was always a public eye, a third actor, impartial, who committed to the good cause in the prisons, that would always monitor what would happen. Not that all the monitoring has been restricted in later stages, obviously public. Ombudsman, and then some of the groups had that possibility, but I guess that was limited in comparison to what has been previously. And that was one of the elements that contributed, I guess, to the possibility of the violations of that egregious nature to happen in that sense. But politically, it was for many of us a shock.
Well, this is really an interesting point, because what you're really doing is you're making a comment about human nature, that as well-intentioned as people are, and as much as they have the courage to try to do something, you need transparency at the same time, because if you don't have transparency, things can slip, things go off the rails. So having that systemic transparency.
It's very important.
Yeah. That's interesting. Okay, let's jump ahead a little bit. So, the Rose Revolution takes place. Georgia goes through these reforms, some of them very risky and daring and successful. I think by 2007, 2008, Georgia was looking like a very different country than it was in 2002, 2003. And then, so we're in August of 2008, and you're the foreign minister at the time. And what happened?
Wow, how much time we have?
Well, let me zero in on a couple things. So, I remember that there were reports of shooting here, shooting there, build up of forces here or there, including inside Russia, which was not unusual for summertime in the Caucasus. People staying up late, drinking, firing a few things off. We already had, to remind people, there were 2 zones inside Georgia that were under a UN protected status of some kind, although Russia was the only implementing force there, theoretically in partnership with Georgia. And we saw things like shooting down of drone vehicles, and we saw movement of forces in and out that weren't supposed to be there, things like that. And we had occasional shooting incidents and skirmish or somebody killed. But this was somehow turned into something vastly different. So what made August of 2008 different? That's the first thing. And then the second thing is, what were you doing and when did you learn that things had changed?
I kept being at that time in the foreign ministry at the time when it was already very tense when we speak about both regions, Abkhazian region and then Tkeshelashvili region. And even at the time it was starting to be quite clear that things were going in the right direction in an unusual way. And the whole process that led to the August was much longer in a sense and complex in terms of the activities that were happening, not only locally in those regions, but then internationally as well. It was the time when the new president of Russia has been elected. It was Medvedev, elected the way he was, but elected. And then it was the tryout again in the very tense situation in which we've been on the ground by the president of Georgia to touch base what could be the possibilities, not that we would think, frankly, at the time that Putin just went aside and then Medvedev would be the main guy who would decide on the issues, but then really to have a genuine attempt of seeing how much difference he could bring maybe, or maybe he would carry the authority of doing something differently in that sense. So it was the meeting that has happened during the framework of CIS, heads of the states meeting at the time. And the first encounter with him wasn't bad in terms of the personal vibe, and then having the openness of talking on those issues. He even himself at the time Medvedev proposed that they would meet soon, quite soon, before the summer even, so that they would talk in more detail somewhere in Russia on what could have been a potential of renewed negotiations in a meaningful sense when it comes to both regions again and the situation there. We've at the time have sent to the Russian side a very interesting proposal as an offer, what would have been, and again, not a rock solid offer obviously, but then the vision, how we would see that what could be the changed scenario basically on the ground, because it was already not only broadened in terms of the stagnation, this fictional frozenness of this conflict, but then it was already melting and it was visible as well. So we really had to do something that would change the paradigm in some sense, so that it would have been different process where meaningful negotiations would lead to some of the changes that would allow above all again possibility of at least gradual return of hundreds of thousands of IDPs and refugees who have been out of their homeland because of the ethnic cleansing that has happened in those regions previously.
All ethnicities.
All ethnicities. Majority Georgian obviously, but then all ethnicities. Jews, Greeks, Estonians even to some degree. Armenians not to that degree because many of them have managed to stay in the Abkhaz region. But even Ossetians from the Tkeshelashvili region that have fled because they didn't think that they would be in a position to stay because they believed that things went wrong at the time in Tkeshelashvili region. Not as targeted perhaps in terms of their life, but then they fled exactly for the reasons of the conflict. So the change of the paradigm was at that time extremely necessary. So the main essence of the offer was that we would have had change that would have had very serious face-saving element to Russians. It was not aggressively anti-Russian in any way. So the idea was that Russians would take the Abkhaz region as an experiment. It was not even on the Tkeshelashvili region at the time. So that would take part of Abkhaz region, Gali region and the Chamchira region going to the Black Sea as the territory of that region, from where Russian forces as the unilateral force at that time that would move behind basically. And we would have had an international police force, not a military force, where Russians would be part of as well, would guarantee security on the ground in this agreed manner. We would have had agreed upon gradual returning those areas of those persons who lived in those areas, and based on their choice. We would have had a free trade zone developed on the coastal line of the Chamchira city at that time, and it would start development of that together basically, so that we would have this competing models basically of free market economy type of the place, more freedoms, more liberties to the persons, good governors, and then development of that region, and then with the hope that gradually, with the persuasion of the Russians, we would have had a gradual change of the type that this inclusive and developing model, which was laid then within the bigger scope of Abkhaz region, and that would have been not short-term project, long-term project, but the vision we would have been leading. And they crashed that out. And the difference of how they did this was that it was the first time that in written language and the responsive letter that we received from them, there was a clear-cut indication that they did acknowledge the right of return. It was a significant difference because nowhere in previous times they would say that the refugees or IDPs have no right to return. They would say that some of them already returned who wanted that it's not our business anyhow, it's our responsibility to decide if they all said yes. And they indicated something that was telling at the time, that they were getting more rigid when it comes to the conceptual understanding of the situation. Then they never delivered on the meeting with the presidents. They met second time in Kazakhstan, again at this
So the first time was in March of 2008?
Yeah, and then it was June. And then the second meeting was very bad at the time. Not that Medvedev was badly relating with the president, but he basically indicated to him that there's nothing he can do and that nothing's going to happen, there will be no meeting or anything. And it was exactly, the time when things were already getting worse. And then how they were getting worse, it was not only the skirmishes. One of the very important elements was when Russians bought paratroopers in the Abkhaz region, 2,000 paratroopers that were not even... Previously, they would always reinforce from time to time their forces, but they would always argue that they're within the cap of the forces they can have under the CIA's mandate. They are peacekeepers, they are not military forces of ordinary nature. And it was the first time in May when they said that we have now these 2,000 paratroopers coming in, and they're not part of even of the UN forces. So you have in a neighboring sovereign country 2,000 paratroopers you are moving in, and you're not even saying what is the mandate of any international character or agreement from the sovereign country that you have for them to be there. So we obviously have been very concerned at the time because this was an indication that they were crossing the Rubicon in many senses in the way how they behaved. And they've coupled that with the railway troops that entered into the country later on, which started to refurbish the railway, which is of no use in terms of the commercial use because the whole railway through Georgia is not working right now to Russia. So they started to refurbish, not with the ordinary engineers, but then it was from the Ministry of Defense forces, but then railway forces that it has that started in a quick way to reinforce the railway. And then when you look into that analytically, you would say that they need to transport ammunition, tanks, and the stuff like that from the ports, which where they could sort of bring these forces like that, so that they are operable when they are getting it. So this was another sign.
So pause for a second. So May of 2008, the Russians put in 2,500 paratroopers outside the peacekeeping mandate that they have. June, President Medvedev gives a response to the Georgian proposals, which says, we're not going to do this. They also say there was no right of return for refugees. They bring in engineering forces to repair railways and bridges to withstand something. What was the response of the international community to these steps on Russia's part? that go beyond what the UN had said, and how do you view that both now, then and now?
I believe that there was possibility of more preventative action. I guess there was this understanding that Russians would do what they actually have done in terms of the nature and scope of the intervention. So there was this understanding perhaps that they were not teasing, but then showing the muscle, and that they would, complicate situation, and with that complicated situation for the government in Georgia, but not to the degree that they would actually do what has actually happened. Because otherwise, if there would have been acceptability of an idea that they can go to that extreme, then more forceful preventative actions can happen. Because the example of that to me was the ultimate plan for negotiations and the way it has been trashed by Russians. So when the paratroopers and all of that has happened, we really had to think hard what we would do as a country, because you have a situation when you agreed previously as a sovereign country to the peacekeeping forces to be in, with the CIS mandate. UN had very limited role to play at the time. There was no real peacekeeping operation they have had. They've been under Chapter 6, but then very limited operation. Then we have these paratroopers. Russians are saying that they are there, they are not part of the peacekeeping forces. So what do you do as a sovereign country? You acquiesce with that, so that by silence you actually agree that it's okay for them to be there, because you have that possibility under international law. You have to have some, time to pass on explicitity of some type with no action. But it could fall into that as well. Russians could have used that over the time. And we wanted somehow, and then we've been always very engaged, obviously, with our partners and friends of the Secretary General. This was the format when we speak about the Abkhaz region. It was OSCE with relation to the Tkeshelashvili region, to activate the negotiating formats that were already in existence, but then nothing was delivering at the time, because frankly our idea at the time was that we had enough messages that we had to be deterred. There was no, this is Russian propaganda, obviously, that we had somewhat of a green light, especially from Americans to go to the war or something like that. We had very tough conversations when there were all attempts for us to be deterred in the way that we would be told with. But I always had the question, what were the messages the Russians were getting, and what type of a deterrence was out there that was played out against them? And we've never had specific information, obviously, on that. Maybe we were not meant to. But we always had this question, what was happening on the other side? How much specificity Russians have been getting with the messages? So then ultimately we've said that, again, we didn't rush to that. We've consulted on that with our friends, saying that basically our idea right now is that we will take out the consent to the peacekeeping forces that Russians have, because it's impossible, because it's an aggressive country already, it's international law in some sense, not in military operation, but then already being on our soil with the paratroopers. We will not do immediately, we will not request that Russians right away to remove forces. Then it will be time, we can negotiate a sufficient amount of time in which they will have to withdraw their forces as they are right now. Let's negotiate international force where Russians will be again part, but we have we can't continue like that. We can't have the situation when they're bringing more and more force, we have more and more shootouts, we have all this intensity, and we just say even nothing when it comes to the state action at that level, when we speak about the legal action that we could have taken. It was a shaking moment at some point, obviously, because I guess the fear at the time was that Russia would use this as a triggering factor for its own action, when the Georgians would have done that. And ultimately, we've been negotiated in the way by the friends of the Secretary General that together they would come up with the solution as of the changed format for negotiations. They would offer to both of us. They would make that happen. So they would have had a changed paradigm in terms of negotiating processes, so that they would really become somewhat different in a meaningful sense. And then that's how the Steinmeier's plan came out. And we agreed, okay, we'll give it a try. And then we didn't went in the direction of taking out the consent to the peacekeeping forces, which, by the way, we said to our friends that if anything would happen, if Russians would move forward, and then there would have been more provocations, they would use one of the legal argument of their forces being there, and then they protecting their forces on the ground. So you have to, that was part of the thinking that we had as well, that we would be consenting for them to be deemed peacekeepers when they were not peacekeepers anymore. But we went with that risk again, and we said that we go ahead, we will give the try to that. offered. It was not a perfect plan. There were some of the elements that were very worrying to us in terms of the time-wise sequencing of what would happen first, what second, in terms of the changed format of negotiations. But it was so important to diffuse this tension that we said that we okay, and with that we'll come to Berlin and then we'll negotiate on the terms. And Steinmeier came to Georgia. He even went to Abkhaz region. He came, by the way, extremely concerned from Abkhaz region. He said that you can sense war when you're there. You feel that everything is somehow prepared for that. And but then Russia said that, and you have to imagine the situation. I mean, it's extremely tense at the time. We're having in Tkeshelashvili Valley region shootouts. We have diplomats going overseas, how the missiles are being fired, how the shootouts are happening in Abkhaz region. There is all this tensity. And there are Russians are saying that we were going for vacation now in summer, so this planned meeting in Berlin, it's not going to happen. We will be at vacation. To me, it was an extremely worrying factor at the time. There was the sign that they were abandoning themselves, being dragged into the negotiating process, and they were getting ready for something else at the time. And so it was not that plain in a sense that it was the same as anything would happen in every other summer, basically. It was substantially different in the way how the process leading to that has developed. And another element that now thinking back again, one can think of, it's always easier to think back, obviously, in that sense, but it was the time when administration was changing here as well. I mean, in the US, it was Olympics, it was change of administration. So maybe if they were looking for the window of opportunity, they'd be careful enough in terms of looking into that. And in our minds, when it comes to Georgian mindset, we've had very bad example of 1921. Not that we've ever had any idea that militarily one can win the war when you are especially Georgian or the Russians. That would have been the stupidest idea one would have. But the main idea was that, do we give a try for defending ourselves or we don't, basically, when the tanks were popping in. And in 1921, military segment and cadets, they fought firstly against Russian army, Red Army coming in at the time, mostly younger generation, and most of them have died. They made that heroic act at the time. But the government has fled right away to France in some sense. Maybe that was an instinct they had that they would do better there, and I would question what that logic may be, so that they would come back somewhat. But we've lost very quickly independence that we fought very hard from the Russian Empire at the time. It was well-developing, social democratic country at the time, but it has been crashed. So it was that, can we look for that to happen second time somehow in the country?
So it's now August 6th, 2008. The West European narrative at the time was that Georgia was again acting provocatively, and that the first shots fired were from Georgia against South Ossetians, and that the Russians came in after that. The other narrative is that the Russians had massed on the northern side of the tunnel, separating Russia and Georgia, and that President Saakashvili had information that they were already passing through the tunnel, and just as you described there, felt that, okay, this is our chance, we either have to defend ourselves or not. What did you understand at the time?
And information that I had at hand, and then we've had obviously full-fledged teamwork that was happening at the time, at the level of the National Security Council as well, was that Russian tanks were not already amassed outside of the tunnel from the north, but then the whole tunnel was clogged already, even to the degree that they were already progressing, because the telephone conversations that our security forces had at the time, that was provided to Talibiani report, commission as well, that has been comprised by the Commission, European Union, with exact conversations between the security forces and then Russian troops, when they talk about the way, how difficult it is for them to get through because there are so many tanks, and they give reports to each other on the progress they make along the way, basically, through the tunnel. But before the tanks, we already had ordinary units of Russian military of defense being present in the Tkeshelashvili Valley region as well. Something that Talibiani report itself has concluded, that prior to the August 8th at the time, already in the territory of Tkeshelashvili Valley region, there were units of MOD, of the Russian Federation. What the report missed to say was a branding, basically. What is it under international law? When you have, under no other pretext of any mandate, your MOD forces being present on a sovereign country's territory in this situation when you have, at that time, already systemic shootouts. Because then again, in Tkeshelashvili region, what was happening was that the shootouts were already not scarce and ad hoc, but then pretty much systemic. Every other night, the whole night would have been even a shootout at some degree. And when it all started, we've had two villages especially, Abnevi and Nulevi, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah, my memory has to be revitalized a bit on that as well, but which were bombed so heavily that some elements of the villages were not already in existence in some degree. And it's like a chessboard, Tkeshelashvili region. We've never had a clear separation line. So one of the elements of a military defensive action that has been described at the time, and necessity of that was that the action had to be taken for some part of the villages that were still resided by Georgians at the time and governed by the central government, would not have been cut off to the degree that there would have been no possibility of people getting out even at the time. So there were different elements of that type that were part of an equation. Larger military defensive techniques when it comes to the invasion of the troops, of the ordinary troops of the Russian Federation, tanks and then military ammunition of that type, and somewhat of a humanitarian element when it comes to the villages that were already at the time under the threat of being completely cut off from any possibility of getting out. And in a way what happened afterwards when the control over those regions, that region has been obtained by the Russian forces full-fledged, we've seen that it was pretty much not only the massive atrocities when the people had to flee under the circumstances of the second round of the ethnic cleansing, but then demolition even at houses and all of it that would have been a remnant. So in a sense, this whole fear of what would happen with the people because of this intensity and with the way how the troops have behaved previously, how they targeted civilian objects and then houses in the shootouts, and then there were many occasions when the delegations of diplomats would go to this region, would take them to those villages and they would see that it were ordinary houses of ordinary people that had been targeted, that there was this firm understanding that civilian population would have been a victim, obviously, because it was already victimized by those actions. So it was very, very tough process to make decisions on that time, and not easy to make. And there were many elements part of that.
So what was your role then? So you're the foreign minister, and you realized now that, okay, this is not just the usual August, this is Russian troops coming into your country and starting the war. What did you do?
It was somewhat of a combination of the feelings that we've had, to be frank on it as well. We've had all these elements of facts that were happening, and then we would have this analysis that Russians could go further than anybody would think, but then ultimately it was even hard for us to believe that they would do what they've done in some sense. So this was this combination of belief and disbelief of what was actually happening, how far they would go. When it came to the point, there was no questions of that. We've had at the time one of the Guillaume Bogheri at the time was Deputy Minister of Foreign Affairs. He was outside of the country at the time. And then he was not even inside of the country when it all happened. Minister of Defense was planning to be outside as well. President himself was planning to go to the Olympics. He had to cancel his flight at the last minute at the time because he was going with his wife to the Olympics as well. So there was always it was a very dynamically developing situation that every other day meant so much of a difference, in a sense that something would happen that you would believe to happen the previous day. And it was very hard to obviously keep up with that when you are at that level of the diplomatic activities, because you have to be constantly informative enough in right time basically to your counterpart so that this information reaches them simultaneously almost to what is happening, because everything was so important that was happening in these gradual and quick developments that were happening on the ground. And this was happening in the times when most of the Europeans were on vacation too.
Right.
So it was, you had to track them down some places like, I don't know, Kushner at the time was on some boat having a vacation in Corsica somewhere, for example. So they had to get some satellite phone for him so that I would communicate with him at the time. It's not that we would expect that people would not go to vacation at the time, but then that was a reality. And it was, I'm very grateful for all that really mobilized their efforts so quickly, and that so many of them, I don't want to admit, but then again, for example, Alex Stupid, he was at the time in special position in OIC, he was right there constantly, and then so many of our friends. And then the greatest challenge there was with the simultaneous communication of the type that we've had, and actually when the military operations have started, communication where one would overcome this disbelief again with the counterparts that they've actually understood that it happened, then anger that many of them had at the time directed at you as well in some sense, because this whole huge problem emerged, and then what have you done type of an approach to it as well, so that it would start to have explain again what actually was happening, not that it all started out of the blue because so many things were happening prior to that. But it was extremely tough, and it all happening at the same time, at the time when we're actually in the scene where all these attacks are happening as well, because the bombs were heard in Tbilisi as well, especially when everything happened in Gori, and then you are in the real war situation and doing all of that. So you have to have, I guess at the time, not only me but then anybody doing the job as well. Really high sense of mobilization and energy and discipline at the same time, with not being lost at the circumstances of that time, and one needs to be psychologically very firm of being at that position, I guess.
So, and there was a major diplomatic initiative to stop it. So President Sarkozy leading European Union at the time. How did you engage with that, and what were your perceptions?
Well, it was very quick action. Sarkozy really took huge initiative at the time. We've been fortunate, I guess, that it was France that was the presidency of the EU, so that Russians would listen to war in those circumstances. I guess it's apparent right now with all the conversations that Sarkozy had in Moscow as well, that we are really determined to go that far as to go to the level of getting into the capital. Putin was very explicit about his vision about the president, what he would do with him. So in a sense, it was this, strategic vision, anger, personal level, or whatever. I mean, all the combinations of that. He really wanted to crash this stupid Georgian government not understanding the message that you can't do what you're doing in that neighborhood. So he wanted to punish this little kids emerging in this small country, which is, in his opinion, destined to be part of Russian sphere of influence, and then you are making all these weird efforts in his understanding and not getting the message of starting from 2086 with all the embargoes he did, all the challenges he faced with us, energy cut off, everything. We still not get. We never got that message, and then he wasn't about that. So simplify that, and but being in the negotiating processes of that type was extremely difficult, because it was not obviously a classical negotiating process. Time was very scarce. Russian troops were progressing, and Sarkozy really made this desperate step of at least stopping that from happening, so that ceasefire would happen in June. And it was very quick action. There was obviously no time for real deliberative text that would emerge out of that, because as a lawyer I can see that the ceasefire agreement, the way it has been agreed, was not as a document, a very well developed document, but it's very explicit on a number of very important issues when it comes to the stoppage of the military operations, but then to what would happen, at least the main parameters after that, that would have been then the foundation for the future negotiating processes to appear. And then again, I mean, Russians, in terms of, they always played these tricks in negotiating process as well, because it has been an agreement that ceasefire agreement wouldn't have been signed, but just agreed upon. So because there was understanding that Russians would make a trick that they would maybe sign up, plus the Ossetians as well to the agreement. So it was an agreement where it was agreed that it would really create orally, but not in written form. But then I remember I've been already in Brussels myself at the time. It was the important meeting at the EU level where I had to participate, and it was already in place after the ceasefire agreement has been reached. Russians have never even, and that's an important factor, because after the agreement, the ceasefire agreement, they have never stopped the progress of their military troops yet. And Lavrov called me, and then he said that well, why are Georgians not signing? Why are they not signing the agreement? As if that was the reason why they were still continuing to progress. So I had a tough conversation with him, identifying that he knew that I knew that the agreement was not about to be signed. So they had no excuse of not stopping the progress of the military troops. And if he had any question, he had to go to the mediator, and that was supposed to be on the French side, not the Georgian side, being complained about that. Then we've had American side engaging at the level one and had clarifying letters and agreement as an interpretation of the agreement being agreed in a different way, which stipulated in a better shape, I would say, some of the elements that were so important for the continuation of the process. The Russians have stopped the progress of military troops only at the point, and I remember it very vividly, when President Bush came out and basically said that he was sending for humanitarian reasons Navy to the Black Sea, and it was an immediate instance within 15 or 20 minutes that I had reports already that the troops have stopped from the Russian side. What they have, they've removed troops from the, as they call Russians, I don't like this term Georgia proper because the whole Georgia is proper in the sense, but the rest of Georgia rather than those regions. But they never removed their troops as they stipulated under the ceasefire agreement up to this day. And they've never removed their troops. They have this reinforced presence as they had up to now as well. And they never launched monitoring mission to enter those regions. That is part of the ceasefire agreement as well. What emerged only apart from the stoppage, supposedly, of the military advancement is the Geneva talks that was part of the ceasefire agreement.
And what was your engagement?